Well, thank you, Paige, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. Well, usually our webinars are teaching times, but today it's going to be a Q&A session. Paige, whose voice you just heard, is our director of marketing, and she's very sensitive to the interests of our clients, what they're telling us, and she felt it was going to be a good idea to have a Q&A session, especially this time of year. So we're here, David and I, to be walking you through, helping you with the questions that you might have about your reserve study that you're in process with, one that you received recently, one that you're working with, one you're trying to understand the budget. How do we fit this into the budget? So this is what we're going to be doing today. We're going to follow this agenda where I'm going to start out with a little bit of time just kind of walking you through how do we make our decisions? What are the rules? What's the framework in this industry? If it was a game, what are the rules? So I'm going to start out with a few minutes, and it starts with the understanding that this whole industry that we're working with, the community association industry, it's an interesting division between the things that belong to the association, the common areas, and then the things that are owned by the individual owners. So there's a separation there. We're going to be talking about what belongs to the association today, those common area elements. And that's important because due to Mother Nature and Father Time, all those common areas are in a constant state of deterioration. They're always getting older, and closer to the time they're going to need to be repaired or replaced. That's just the world that we live in. And it's going to be that deterioration that defines the cost, how fast things are deteriorating, what's deteriorating, when it's going to need that cash, when there's going to be a cash drop at your association because you need to spend the money. And here in the community association world, it's up to the board to set a budget that keeps up. That's their chartered responsibility, and that's found in your governing documents. And then part of the teamwork, it's then up to the owners to pay their fair share. They became a member of the community. So the board says, hey, folks, this is what it costs to live here. And the owners say, okay, how much per month, how much per quarter, how much per year. And that's how the association stays operable, how it stays functional, how it stays sustainable. And in this situation, I have to lay, again, some foundational ideas that owning and caring for real estate is expensive. Carefree is something that has been a term that has been rolled around when they speak about community association living. It's great to live in an association because the association takes care of the park or the green belts or the hallways or the elevators, things like that. But it may be carefree, but it's not free because, remember, all those common areas don't take care of themselves. And as we prepare these reserve studies, I want to make it clear that we're not in the guessing business. We identify the components, these fundamental common area elements that are going to appear in your reserve study based on National Reserve Study standards. There's a 3-part test that you see on screen. We'll refer to this 3-part test as we get into the Q&A, that anything appearing in the reserve study has to pass all 3 tests, which is it's the association's obligation, again, a common area maintenance responsibility. It's reasonably anticipated. We are in the budget business, and it has to be a significant cost. Otherwise, if it was insignificant, that'd be trivial and you'd handle it out of the operational maintenance budget. And we're not, again, guessing about something 10 or 20 or 30 years into the future because we look at it now, we establish its condition, and then we update the reserve study at least every 3rd year from this point onward. So there's no wild presumptions about the future. And then we evaluate the starting point, the financial starting point, how much cash you have. Is that good or is that not good? You may have $100,000 or $500,000, and the big question is, does that work for you? Is that a good starting point or not? And that's measured by this concept called percent funded. And I like the little illustration that you see on the screen. It's the balance between what's going on at the association, how much deterioration you have, and how much cash you have. You want them to be in balance. And in balance is the 100% point. And this parameter, percent funded, is significant because it's a key indicator of are you prepared or not. Now, the key result when you're not prepared is a special assessment recommendation. And you can see on your chart here that in the 0 to 30% range, special assessment recommendations are common. And when you get to 70% and above, you can see that the special assessment recommendations go almost to zero. Basically, it means you have enough cash. And so that tells us where we want to direct you. We want to direct you towards having enough cash so that you're free from the surprises of special assessments. And then with that starting point, we think, okay, what do we craft as far as a funding plan? And we're guided again by National Reserve Study standards with a 4-part funding principles. We want you to have sufficient cash. We want that multi-year plan to be stable from year to year. We want it to be evenly distributed over the homeowners so everyone pays their fair share over time, kind of a total cost of ownership issue. And we want it to be fiscally responsible. We want a plan that the board can stand on, that the homeowners, although they may not like it, they have to say, well, darn it, it is reasonable and it's responsible, and that's their job to tell us what it costs to live here in Happy Acres. Now, when we do this, we are using the National Reserve Study standards. It's going to guide our terminology. I probably should have put that first, but component selection, funding goal, funding methodology, funding plan strategy, and I asterisked funding goal and funding plan strategy because I want to just explain what we're working with here. This is a sample graph. We may do a few examples today depending on your questions, but it goes time is left to right in years, in 5-year increments. And what we're graphing here is the percent funded. You can see they start at 40-some% funded, and they end up at about the 100% point. Now, what we describe this as is the process of heading towards a goal. It means that we are, in this case, a full funded goal. We are full funding or fully funding. Okay? That's the process. They're at, let's say, 42% funded now. They are not fully funded, but they are fully funding. And David, can I get you to help clarify with your Florida background here?
Absolutely. We've always described it, especially in the past when I've explained it to clients, is funding is an action. And typically when it comes to legislation, especially that which we've seen in New Jersey and Florida, the requirements typically revolve around fully funding or adequately funding your reserves, which is looking forward. In this same graph, the 100% funded in relation to the National Reserve Study standards, that is described as a position. It is being 100% funded at any given time. So it's usually or typically a yes/no answer. Are you fully funded? Yes or no. That doesn't mean, let's say you're 60% funded, you may still be fully funding because it is a progression over time. We like to say it's a marathon, not a sprint. And just because you're not fully funded now, you may still be fully funding towards a better and brighter future.
Fantastic. Okay. So the difference between the process, the action, and the condition of being fully funded. And as we talk about these issues today having to do with reserve studies, basically the cost of what we're going to have to recommend, your fund recommended reserve transfers, that's primarily driven by the components. Do you have balconies? Do you have elevators? Do you have 5 tennis courts? Do you have swimming pools? All these kinds of things. Do you have wood siding? All these kinds of things. There's a secondary factor, and it's when these projects happen. And then if you have a strong or a weak starting point, some other influences are interest and inflation. Are you getting a lot of interest on your reserve cash or just a little bit? And then the funding goal. Are you trying to insulate yourself from special assessments by fundamentally being prepared? Or are you going to risk having special assessments by having a weak reserve fund? So there's primary and secondary factors, but these all influence the results in your reserve study. And my mom used to say, the proof is in the pudding. And so you can see this real estate agent showing this couple here, kind of a rundown association. And what do you say? As you can see, they aren't wasting the HOA dues on funding reserves. Well, that's reflected in home values. So it's kind of a circle here. You want to take good care of the property. The governing documents tell you to. It's good for home values. But yes, it costs money to take good care of the property. And so with that introduction, we're now going to get into the meat of today's program, fielding your questions. So Paige, what has our audience told us that they want to hear about?
All right. Thanks, Robert. Yeah, we had quite a few questions coming in during your intro. So let's go ahead and jump in. First question. Our reserve study recommends we have 70% funded, and we are currently at 55.7%. 70 seems way too high. Can you help with that?
Yeah, let me take you back. I may do this. I hope you're not getting seasick. There we go. This one. And we can show some other ideas, but you see in this chart that the cost is driven by Mother Nature and Father Time. The question is, are you going to be prepared or are you going to be surprised? And it's not a high goal to be 100% funded. I want to make that clear. About 30%, between 28 and 30% of the associations across the country are above 70% funded. That's a lot of associations. So it would be a simple thing to tweak your reserve funding a little bit faster. So you're going a little bit faster than the rate that things are deteriorating. And over the next 5 years or so, maybe 10 years, climb up and get yourself into the 70% range and have a longer goal of being closer to 100%. David, have I missed anything there?
I would say so, or I don't think you've missed anything. I would just have one thing to add in that it usually is a moral or ethical argument of the 100% funded mark, and that's truly one of the main pillars of our recommendations within our reserve studies is a fully funding recommendation to eventually get to 100%. And the main reason for that is if you aim for anything lesser than that, oftentimes there is deterioration that has occurred that has not been funded. So you're always behind the 8 ball and never in front of or proactively accounting for those items. Now, we also take a look at this data in the chart that Robert has showed, and that does give us a very clear viewpoint because one of the major goals is to eliminate or mitigate special assessments whenever we can, eliminate surprises. And with the data that we have, the 70% mark is really where you see a significant difference where it's mitigated to nearly the highest degree. And so anything beyond that is that moral high ground. It's collecting everything that's deteriorating, and we still believe in that. But after that 70% mark, you've mitigated or should have mitigated the majority of your special assessment risk and eliminated those surprises.
Okay, great. Next question here. In addition to a reserve fund, is it also advisable for an HOA to establish a rainy day fund or an emergency fund to cover unexpected medium to larger community expenses that may not be covered by insurance?
That's a good question. We have some clients setting aside something they call their deductible fund, and they have that there because it's not a predictable expense. Remember, that's one of the three-part test. One element of the three-part test. We have some that set aside a little margin in case they have a lot of snow removal in a particular year. That way they don't kill their operating budget and the nominal amount of snow removal costs that they have. So that's a nice extra little pocket of money on the side. David, your thoughts on that?
In my personal opinion, I think for overages and contingencies where the unknown develops, that is a strong idea to have some rainy day fund. One thing I do want to point out is typically when it comes to deductibles, at least personally, I've always held that reserves, when adequately or fully funded, especially, typically in your reserve balance end up having more than the necessary deductible, and that deductible should be expensed from reserve items. So in an example, let's say Florida gets hit by another hurricane. Let's cross our fingers, hope that doesn't happen for another 5 or 10 years, if not more. But if you have fully funded your reserves for 5 of the 20 years, you would theoretically have 5/20ths or 1/4 of the total replacement cost of that roof system. And so as you move forward in time, you're only collecting or have in your reserves a higher and higher proportion of that total replacement cost. At a certain point, you should have more than the deductible itself and would be able to fully fund the deductible through reserves. Now, that doesn't always happen. It isn't always that, let's say, convenient, especially say in the first 5 years, you may not have enough for that deductible because you just spent everything to replace that roof. So it is a balancing act. And I think as we move through this Q&A, Robert and I will probably continue to hammer that term balance home. And it's something that should absolutely be considered, but there should be an asterisk there because, let's say, overfunding a contingency fund could pull away your attention from fully funding your reserves or cost the homeowners more when there is already funds that could be sufficient in your reserves.
Yeah.
So it's an ongoing consideration.
Yeah. I think our counsel is going to be check with your reserve study provider and ask them.
I would say so, yeah.
All right. Can a board spend money on items not listed in the reserve study? The expenditures are on non-capital items and were not listed in the minutes as being spent from reserves, not a loan.
David, can we let's maybe talk about a couple of scenarios. Let's say, let me try to amplify that question a little bit. Let's say your reserve component list is pretty simple and you want to spend some money on something you don't see in the reserve study. Let's say the pool heater. And you say, well, it's association responsibility, fails every 10 years, pretty much on schedule, and it's significant cost. Why is that not there? It seems to meet the criteria of being a reserve component. I would say reach out to your reserve study provider and say, how are we supposed to do this? That's always going to be an easy call, easy email. If it's something different, like the garbage truck always comes around the back corner, and on that back corner, it always regularly, it cracks our asphalt, makes potholes. It always beats up the asphalt at the rear corner of our association. Can we replace the asphalt there with concrete from reserves? There's interesting questions. There's gray areas. Is that a capital improvement? There's a lot of answering of that question that is, it depends. So, David, can you think of some other gray area?
Yeah, I think I can try to hammer down at least the ones we can clarify for sure. New additions, so capital expenditures that aren't in a reserve study, but all the rage right now is, let's say, pickleball courts. No, you shouldn't use reserves to newly install a pickleball court where those weren't in the past. Or let's say there were no pickleball courts in the past. We don't believe you should use reserve funds for something that didn't exist. The purpose of reserve funds is ongoing, proactive, and purposeful maintenance of your existing components within a community. However, Robert talked about gray areas. Now we're going to talk about, let's say, conversion of a tennis court to pickleball courts because no one uses that tennis court anymore and we need to shift over or shift pace. The answer is it depends in this case, but also potentially a mix of both.
David,
can reserve funds be used?
David,
Potentially. Yes.
I was wondering if Paige has a scorecard on how many times you and I say it depends.
Absolutely. You keeping count, Paige? We have 50-50 so far.
Let me make a game out of it.
So with the conversion of the tennis court to the pickleball courts, technically, let's say your tennis court and all of its related components or assets are within the reserve study. replacement of it, resurfacing of the court itself, that does open up to use of the existing reserve funds for those items as part of the conversion. But it is likely that that conversion is going to be more expensive than a typical resurface or replacement because you're converting it. It's a higher scope of work. So this is where you get into probably good to discuss with your reserve study provider. Your accountant, I would say, is another good one. And as always, we're not legal counsel. So at that point, you also probably want to tie in your legal counsel to confirm it's all wrapped into a nice bow. But you may have the opportunity to pull some reserve funds from existing tennis court, and you may have to produce other funds elsewhere in the form of a special assessment or loan to get that done as the additional supplemental cost. So toggle, new addition and conversion.
Yeah.
Right.
What you're thinking about, if the tennis court needs to be resurfaced, is there any problem with resurfacing it and restriping it for a pickleball court and putting in a couple new, some new elements to make it a quick transition so it can be both?
Typically, I would find no issue in it.
Yeah.
Usually the only time you find or have major issues is these huge, at least in my experience, complexes that turn 4 tennis courts into 16 pickleball courts. And you're talking about difference of tens, hundreds of thousands between the two projects. In adding a net or two and one line of 4-foot chain link fencing between the 2 new pickleball courts, or portable nets is something that seems to become more frequent. Those would be allowable, in my opinion, but it does vary from case to case.
Yeah, same here. That, to me, that seems like an easy yes.
All right. We are taking over a new HOA, which reserves seem to be very underfunded. How should we approach this before going to the board with requesting a reserve study, which they aren't wanting to do just yet?
Wow. It sounds like a manager asking, what do we do? I think getting the reserve study is the first step. You need to know where you stand. What are the obligations? What's the common area maintenance responsibilities? Get them in a list, and that all sounds like a reserve study. David, isn't that, or what you're thinking?
Completely agreed. When it comes to new developments, especially when there's a transfer to an HOA, the unfortunate truth is that oftentimes you start behind the 8 ball because development may have taken multiple years in a lot of development cases. So your fully funded balance or the deterioration that has occurred to this point has already started. I think it's a common saying that Robert uses. Is it the bill always comes due or time waits for no man? Yes, both.
Tide in time, wait for no man. Yeah. Well, what about if it's a manager taking over a new account? Okay. Happy Valley Villas comes and says, hey, we want you guys to manage us. And you say, great. So you have another account, your management company is growing, and you look at Happy Valley Villas and boy, it's a dog. So you feel good about getting a new account, but yikes, this is going to be trouble. Probably the reason they are trouble is they've been underfunding their budget. They've been borrowing from reserves without repaying, stalling on getting projects done. You need to have order and you need to have a plan. If you're going to do a good job managing that association, you need to have a plan moving forward, and that's a reserve study.
Absolutely agree.
From the marketing point of view, I'd also say educate them. I think that if you can help them understand why they need a reserve study, the importance, the fear of special assessments, anything like that, share this webinar with them, share other webinars, articles, whatever you can, just to help educate them as well.
Yeah, you don't have to stand on your own word. This is what happens in the community association industry. You need to set aside funds to take care of your property, or Mother Nature and Father Time are going to dance all over your place. Mm-hmm. And the property values are going to go down. So it's just normal best practice for what to do in the community association industry.
Absolutely. All right. Where can we get a copy of the reserve study standards? We have an irrigation system and they are suggesting a 50-year life. Everything I can see says PVC is a 50 to 100-year life. What is the standard?
I hear 2 questions there. One is, what are the National Reserve Site standards? And I can put a link in the outline. It's on the CAI national website, which is caionline.org. You have to click through a few things to actually find the standards, but it sounds like they're looking for what are the expectations for component X for useful life, that kind of thing. Wow. I've spent 38 years with this company, and we have, for those 38 years, been primarily basing our useful life expectations on what we see actually happening among our clients. So we have the good fortune to be able to build that off of our experience with clients. David, could they just ask their landscaper if they want to know how long does plastic pipe last?
I would say so. Typically, the best practice or best recommendation would be to consult with an industry professional. What I will say is that it depends. Realistically, there's a lot of environmental factors that can affect this. So one of the major items is tree root systems, how quickly they can grow around said pipe and, say, invade and break those pipes. So oftentimes you may even see useful lives shorter than that because certain systems could be surrounded by oak trees and be torn to shreds within 30 years. If those oaks are, say, older in nature. Now, the best answer is probably going to come from that landscaping or irrigation vendor because they know your property specifically. A reserve study provider does their best to look at the property and visually assess it, but it would be next to impossible unless they also brought a shovel and dug up the entire community for them to visually assess those pipes. So I believe that they're probably using a form of professional judgment to include it because they feel it's the best thing to do, but it may not be the be-all, say-all when it comes to that. There are other factors that I do want to note just in relation to the reserve study standards that may also help in this case. The reserve study standards I touched on state that it has to be reasonably anticipated. And so a vendor or even a reserve study provider may not want to commit to, say, more than the bare minimum estimate of that piping. You noted on your general research that it's 50 to 100 years, and it is possible in many cases that PVC piping can last that long. But there's so many different variables that to state it would is a tough call for a professional to make, especially when there's limited information on it. So within those, there are some limitations in what reserve professionals can or will make within their judgments as a form of protection and a form of really what I've described as our belief at which point you should be financially capable of replacing, in this case, your irrigation system. If your irrigation system, let's say, gets to 50 years old, is still functioning properly, and you have minimal repairs here and there, and not exponentially increasing year to year, then you may be able to push out the remaining useful life by several years at that point. But saying maybe in year 10 that it could last another 50 years is a tough judgment call. So there may be a company standard or a reserve professional's opinion towards the standard that they use. So those do weigh into our considerations when creating a reserve study.
David, while you were talking, I was thinking more and more, I like that idea of just asking your landscaper because it depends on so many factors. Are the plastic pipes above the ground and getting hit by the sun and getting brittle? Are you in a area of the country where you're getting freeze thaw, and so the pipes are sometimes icing up and cracking? Is the ground stable or unstable? Are there kids around there chasing? Is it next to a field and there's going to be people walking on it? There's so many factors that your landscaper probably knows, yeah, this is trouble. You're going to be happy to get 15 years out of this. Or they may say, geez Louise, not in my lifetime. And that may be just plain a good thing to know.
Absolutely.
This next question kind of follows up on that. Are your estimated replacement costs determined by national average or specific to the city where the association is located?
David, do you want to take
on? Yeah. We do consider national data within these price estimates. But a lot of times, and in most cases, within the reserve studies that at least we provide, everything is regionally driven by our offices and catered to within the specific decisions of each project manager, the city and or location that each association resides in. So to answer that question, it's a lot more geographically driven. We know there are differences between, say, Los Angeles and Des Moines and New York City versus Orlando, Florida. They're all regionally driven, and the difference needs to be applied within the reserve studies.
Yeah, I want to add that there's a lot of factors in there. So it's not just the cost, it's the useful life. Again, are you in a alpine environment where you have extreme weather? And then there's, would you say Los Angeles, Des Moines, Iowa, and New York, there's incredible differences in labor costs. And then the materials. There may be some materials that are more popular in some due to style, construction style, some areas of the country than others. So what we do is primarily driven locally, although we are sensitive to national averages. We know that prices are creeping up at a certain rate on a national level, but it's not going to be too big of a difference cost-wise of the actual material, because any company can put it on a truck and get it anywhere in this country without too much of a problem. So think useful life, material costs, labor costs, those all dial in to tell you what it's going to cost in your association. And the cost that appears in at least an association reserve study is locally based.
Next question here. We're a new board playing catch up because dues remain flat for 8 years. How do we prioritize work when there are several large, costly projects, all of them deferred, well past their remaining useful life? Do you recommend we involve homeowners to determine project priority to increase community support? And how do we tie in the benefit of this work in a way that helps homeowners understand and accept shorter-term financial pain in exchange for longer-term value?
Ooh, that was a loaded question, wasn't it?
That's the loaded question.
Paige, would you be able to shift that over to the answer section so I can
You bet.
track that one down?
Yeah. David, I started writing things down. When I think about priority, the first thing is life safety. So we're talking balconies. We don't want anything collapsing. We don't want anyone getting hurt. We don't want trees with limbs that are going to fall and hit somebody. Carports are going to drop on the cars. So safety is number one. Number two is something that's going to increase in cost. So a roof, catch it before it leaks, because once it starts to leak, it's going to get really expensive because all of a sudden you're doing a lot of interior damage repairs. This is going to be another situation where you need to reach out to your reserve study provider. They're going to be able to help, and they're going to be able to maybe play some scenarios and dial in hopefully an answer that involves probably a combination of some special assessment now to give you a cash infusion to get started. Maybe you tackle the safety problems right now, and then next year you'll be able to do the roof project. So combination of special assessment and assessment increases. I have a feeling that your homeowners know the place is starting to look run down, and that's a problem we got to solve. So if your monthly assessments need to go up from $350 to $425, your sales pitch is, folks, owning real estate is expensive. We need to catch up. The reality is we're going backwards. We're not keeping up.
And just to add a couple of points to that, the specific question to should we recommend or involving homeowners to determine project priority? To add on to Robert's comment, typically the answer would be no when it comes to priority of safety and necessary projects. The main reason being, there's a common saying, too many cooks in the kitchen. When you start giving everybody a say in this, you're going to sit in the board of directors meeting for 5 hours and feel like nothing got done because everybody's going to pitch in saying which one they think needs to be done first. So there are opportunities to involve them. So when we say necessary projects, so life safety, those are absolutely necessary. And then you say necessary projects to say the function of a building. And in this case, I'm going to use a high rise as an example. If the cooling tower is older, everybody is going to be upset if that cooling tower goes down and there's no air conditioning in it, because everybody is then suffering. So as a board or as a manager, trying to wade the waters of how much involvement to provide, those types of things, probably not. Those would be deemed necessary and higher priority than any subjective items. Some that you can levy to increase community support is typically the aesthetic items. So your lobby remodel, or, the billiards room versus the hallways versus, those types of things that are aesthetic or visual, but may be more of luxury, I guess you could say, when it comes to funding those projects. That may be something to boost to get some support one way or the other as to which one to tackle first. You also should consider, I had noted down, downtime. So if your elevator is getting to the age of needing modernization or replacement, the downtime for elevators now throughout the country is 6 to 12 months, potentially up to 18 to 24, depending on the vendor and the amount of demand in your region. So you may need to get the ball rolling now, but when it actually is done, you may be 3 or 4 projects finished by the time they actually arrive on site to start that project. And I assume that this question revolves around project management as much as funding. So we know that there is a reality to how much can actually be done on one property at any given time. And doing too many puts an enormous strain on the board members or the property manager to get those done and oversee them. So there is that reality that we do acknowledge. You can't delay the things that have to be done for safety purposes, but prioritizing those and having a strong knowledge of how long it's going to take to start up, specify or create specifications for, and then actually conduct the work, including downtime or lead time, is important to understand.
Hey, David, I had one client, 6 stories, 2 elevators, and they were in a bad situation, didn't have much cash, and old elevators, and they made the call to modernize just one of their 2 elevators. That way, they were crossing their fingers that the old one was going to squeeze out a couple, 3 more years. And in that interim, they were getting the new one. And when we got there, the new one was functioning, and they were all breathing a sigh of relief that, okay, the new one's going to work for 30 years. We're just going to ride the old one until it dies. And that was going to be hopefully another 5 years or so. But you can place strategy on this. And sometimes, as David was suggesting, be proactive, appreciate. Maybe sometimes it's good to spend a little bit of money now and get things fixed and working so you have firm ground, so you can take a breath and work on other problems. It's an interesting challenge that an older community or a deteriorated community presents. And again, check with your reserve study provider. They can help you navigate forward, because we've seen so many different things. Sometimes things done well, sometimes foolish decisions that boards have made. We can help you benefit from those lessons learned.
And I would say most reserve study providers should be happy to present to your board of directors or your membership in that way. I know I've stood in front of hundreds of individuals to say these very things as, these are the projects that need to be done. This is the purpose of the reserve study. This is why a special assessment needs to be, set and collected, is because you have these items that are pressing. And there is always a discussion when it comes to customer service, the report, even though maybe it shows a 0 remaining life, what may be considerable to defer by a year or 2 with minimal effect to your reserve study, let's say, component list, so you can shift them back, but it won't meaningfully cause a negative effect to the community itself. So your project manager should be a friend and a resource in that, and provide guidance as to whether they feel that's possible or not. And that will also assist in your presentation to the membership, or they may present for you and then take that load off of you.
Let's see here. Can reserve funds be used to extend the life of an item by doing repairs?
Yes, I think you see David nodding. I'm leaning yes. Minor repairs are operational budget issues, but like a repair, if you're going to repair a quarter of the roof and give your whole roof system another 5 years, that's a good use of reserve funds. If you can replace a gate area of your perimeter fence and that way do a repair there and stall the entire fence replacement another few years, again, good use of reserve. But check with the reserve study provider. They may have some insights for your particular property when you get to that change point between, just spend some of your operational money, minor repair, versus withdraw from reserves.
Okay, we changed our procedures in maintaining our tile roofs on several buildings. As such, we believe we have extended the life of said roofs by at least 20 years each. Thus, we appear to be overfunded for replacement for said roofs and would like to transfer a portion of those reserves to another component that is quite low in its percent funded equation. Can we do this?
David, that sounds like a Florida question. Straight line Florida question.
I'm going to assume that this is a Florida client or a client that is using the component method towards funding reserves. The transition of funds from an existing reserve account to another typically, and I would recommend consulting with a legal counsel and your accountant before doing so, the process that we saw unfolding most of the time is a meaningful transfer through a vote and acceptance of membership. So usually there's more freedom to allocate funds differently within your existing budget as a board decision. So allocation, again, the action of funding. Now, if the funds are funded in that position, in the way that they are, there were typically more hurdles to go from one to the other, one account to the other, I should say, with transfers. So this did happen, and what our most frequent recommendation was in this case is to consider pooling your reserve funds. And because of that, you would no longer have a need to transfer funds from one place to the other. It would allow an aggregation or a combination of all of those funds into one pool. And then the overage of, let's say, your roofing is already accounted for in that calculation and can be used for those reserve items. Before I conclude, I do want to note that I have had clients argue or note the security in having specific reserve accounts. So roof versus painting versus exterior lights versus asphalt. And we do acknowledge those as a way of protection that was born upon embezzlement, stealing, or misallocation of funds in prior years. But in the current time, that is becoming less and less frequent, or should be, with the available amount of information to homeowners. Budget should be provided every year with a reserve schedule. And with that, those board member or those homeowners should know what is coming due by looking at said reserve schedule and by attending the annual meeting that's occurring. Usually there's a discussion of what's in the purview of next year or the next couple of years. So long story short, yes, you can. My belief is you're likely to have to follow some steps that will be guided by your accountant or legal attorney. But also we ask that you consider or discuss with your reserve study provider the option of pooling your reserve funds as well, which would also take a membership vote.
It did. The person wrote back in, it's a California entity.
Oh,
Interesting.
crazy. We see that very rarely in California. David is generally from the Tampa area, so he's the Florida expert on this show today. But no, in California, pool your reserves. Do the cash flow method. The problem goes away. Simple answer.
Okay. Can a community achieve fully funded status, or at least 70% funded, through baseline funding?
David, why don't you introduce kind of the idea and I will demonstrate. How about that?
Sure. I would say it's possible, but not often. So the goal of a baseline funding plan is only to keep your reserves above zero or cash positive through a 30-year projection. So it is possible that in the ups and downs of that cash flow projection that you reach 70%, and the next year you could potentially reach 0% and you have $500 in your reserves. It all depends on the timing and cost and what we typically refer to as spread of your reserve components um, the significance, I guess you could call them, of the reserve components within your reserve study. If you have one item that is 80% of your reserves, it may look like you're funding nearly at the fully funding level, but then as soon as you expense that, you could drop to 10% or lower because all of it was allocated to that one item. Robert, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I pulled up a UPlanet case here. I just wanted to show what's going on. Kind of in that PowerPoint slide that I showed earlier where you saw the Association Reserve Fund growing towards the 100% point. Hopefully you're seeing here that this association, coincidentally, starting out at maybe about 45% funded, and this you can see is a full funding plan. They go from where they are. The net effect is they're going to end up at the 100% point and stabilize there. You can note here that that's $2,340 per month. Now let's go to baseline. And you can see now all they're doing is bouncing around, just staying above zero. If we were to extend it, they would bounce around and bounce around and bounce around between 0 and 50, 0, 60 in this case. But a baseline plan doesn't net get you to fully funded. You're always in that, as I like to think, the 0 to 30% scary range where you're tempting special assessments if things don't go perfectly right. So what do we say, 2340, and baseline plan is 2090. And again, the difference is striving to strengthen your reserves so that you're not going to surprise your owners with special assessment. You're just confronting the reality of the ongoing rate of deterioration.
I thought this was an interesting question, so I'm curious what your answers would be here. I'm new to a board. What are the top 3 recommendations for me to start with? I'm an accountant, so the financial stuff doesn't concern me. What should I be looking for, concerned about, asking about related to our reserve?
Okay. When I think about that, I say, do you have a reserve study? Who is it prepared by? Is the person a credentialed person? Do they have their RS or PRA? Those are the 2 credentials in the reserve study field. And when was it prepared? You want a reserve study within the last 3 years. Anything else, pretty much worthless. Especially you look back the last 3 years, we've had COVID, we've had high inflation, we learned things like supply chain. And so once you know those 3 things, look for what was recommended in the funding plan. Are you doing it? So if you're the new board and you find out the recommendation was $2,340 and you're only funding $1,000 a month, you know you're drowning. And look at your percent funded. Where is your starting point? David, just some other thoughts on that?
I think you hit pretty much all of my thoughts on the nose. When it comes to the reserve study, look at the immediate projects, especially for, as Robert mentioned, an older reserve study. It may have said, or let's say it was done in 2018, and you're looking at it now, and that was the most recent. Realistically, all of those costs are no longer applicable by probably a very large margin. And that is not the reserve study provider's fault because of the massive amount of inflation that really began COVID and post-COVID due to everything that has occurred, natural disaster-wise, COVID, supply chain issues, et cetera. So if you don't have a current reserve study, that's the first thing that you need to determine. If you do have a current reserve study, the component list, immediate projects, where you stand, and Robert touched on all that very eloquently.
Okay, great. We have time for one final question. We will be answering all these questions in a webinar outline, but final question here. The question of price estimates is significant. I often find that bids are higher than the reserve study estimates. Should the default inflation rate be more than the standard 3%?
It's a fun topic.
Yeah. We spent an entire webinar on that one question, but make sure you're separating 2 things. We said it in the last answer. How old is your reserve study? If your reserve study is 2 years old, no doubt the prices today are going to be much higher than stated in a 2-year-old reserve study. So look at that. So the current cost is what's significant. It is dangerous to put a higher inflation rate into a reserve plan, because if you look back in the history of this country, inflation has for the last 2 or 3 decades been stable or I should say averaged in the, what, David, 2.5%, 3% range. So
Yes.
it's been much higher the last couple of years. I have zero expectation inflation will be 6 to 10% for the next 30 years. So I do not put 6 to 10% inflation in a reserve plan. I want to make sure my current costs are there, but I believe in this country, and I believe the powers in place in the government and the Federal Reserve and all that kind of thing, they're going to bring inflation down to a healthy level. So we plan for inflation at a reasonable United States of America rate, but we got to get those current costs anchored.
And we are in an immediate time of high inflation. I looked at the data that we most recently went about, and even on the past 30-year average for CPI, we were about 2.5%. We look at other things such as construction cost indexes as well. And overall, the change per year on that typically hits around the 3 to 4% range, but it's not a 30-year mark that they began tracking within. And so as you look out farther and farther, the percentage on average goes lower and lower. Now, if we continue in this, let's say another 5 years or another 3 years, then we may consider shifting up by a quarter or half of a percentage point. But you don't want to be drastic, as Robert said, it has a 30-year effect. So when you talk about the difference of 3% compounded every year for 30 years and 4% compounded every year over 30 years, that's a major effect. And getting your reserve study updated is the easiest way to keep those cost estimates exact, or as exact as they can be, even within our profession. We receive bids to review the scope of work and the cost for multiple clients, and they may have a 40% variance high and low between the lowest bidder and the highest bidder. And it's just so extreme at this point. The unfortunate truth is that the work costs whatever someone is willing to pay, or similar to real estate. The home is valued at about what someone is willing to pay for it. If someone doesn't buy it in 30 days, that value goes down. And you start to see the averages go down when there's less demand. So if there's a very high demand for said work, a couple of key ones that we know of: pools, elevators, roofing, and in-demand materials for construction purposes, the inflation on those are going to be higher because of the demand related to them. So anyways, I went on my TED Talk. I apologize for that.
That's a preview of a future webinar on exactly that topic.
Some of the components shown as needing to be replaced next year are disputed by some homeowners, and they use this as a reason to not trust the experts and therefore not follow the reserve allocation recommendations. How do we handle this?
David, are we recording? Can we say some nasty things here?
Well, it's a fun argument. It's one that is frequent, I guess you could say, in this profession. If you want, I can take lead on this one, Robert.
Yeah, it's fair.
And really, I want to preface this with a reference to the National Reserve Study Standards and how we, in our framework, see reserve components. When we go to set a remaining useful life on an item, one major consideration may be the actual replacement interval, but it may also incorporate consideration of at what point we feel the association should be financially capable of completing the project. So in your example, let's say an AC system is already 14 years old, and in that region, we've assigned a 15-year life, which means it will be coming due soon. We've certainly had homeowners argue that there's no issues, nothing is wrong with it, it's still running. And we certainly understand those things and take those into account. But with mechanical systems, we may have we have a set useful life for a reason. And so I liken it to driving a 2003 Toyota Camry with 400,000 miles. It runs great. I haven't had any issues up to this point, but I do get in the car and I turn the key and I hope it starts every morning. And if it doesn't, I have to buy a new car. So it's similar in those types of considerations that it may very well last longer than that 15 years in this example, but it may
To
not.
be ready.
Yes, you need to be financially ready. The other opportunity is to go talk to the industry professional if there are arguments against what the reserve study has shown. We do in our profession go and inspect a property. It's a visual inspection and we're doing it as a snapshot. We don't have all of the contextual details of the history and the maintenance leading up to it unless it was provided to us as part of this engagement. So if there's valid arguments as to why it should last longer, we would certainly as reserve professionals be open to hearing those out. But a lot of times the disconnect is because of the lack of information we may have. If homeowners are speaking out on this and basically using it's my opinion, what should matter is the professional opinion. And if a professional, say your association's vendor, comes back and says, yeah, I do think it could last 3 or 4 more years and you're showing a 0, we'd be happy to adjust it at that point and find a common ground among everybody. But just general opinions don't carry as much weight, I should say. Robert, would you agree with that?
Well, you've given me enough time for my emotions to calm down. It's the board's job to lead, and it's the homeowner's job to follow. And the board's job is not to make everyone happy. The board's job is to run the association. And sometimes the board needs to say, thank you very much. I've heard you, but we need to be funding this much in reserves. Next. So it sometimes just comes right down to that. Paige.
All right. We had quite a few questions about landscaping come in already. What is your thought or opinion on large landscaping / arborist items?
Yeah, think about the 3-part test. Is it common area? Let's presume yes. Is it reasonably predictable? Well, gee, trim your trees every 3rd year or something like that. Maybe you replant the color in the front of the association every 5th year. I don't know. The bushes start to get ugly after 20 years. There are cycles. So yes, association responsibility, reasonably predictable, significant cost. When you look at what plants cost nowadays, you could easily be spending 5 figures on this kind of stuff. So speak to your landscaper, well, actually speak to your reserve site provider. It's a legitimate reserve expense in most cases because it passes that 3-part test.
The only asterisk I'll provide to that is that many clients opt or choose to exclude it from their reserves on the basis that they're going to do as needed projects here and there, or they have some alternate fund, even if it's the operating surplus that they may pull from to do these projects. I would say you can make an argument both ways, which if it's not in your reserve study, the likely answer if you ask your reserve study provider is that it can be. It's difficult to project replacement costs and intervals for a wide range of items. So as Robert mentioned, tree trimming is typically a set interval, which helps the case for adding it to reserves. Replacement of a certain number of trees may be different because of the outside factor. So, is there disease that's spreading throughout them that's causing a need for replacement? How frequent are storm events that cause major removal and replacement needs? Those are all things that you can argue both ways within the reserve study standards. It may be predictable and you can establish a fund because you believe it is, or you could argue the opposite and say it's something that we want to tackle as needed, or it's too unpredictable at this time to fund. Either way, definitely talk with your reserve study provider.
All right. What is the best way to present the current study to owners that is informative and concise?
Oh, I like that one.
A very good question.
Yeah, I kind of led with it. There's 3 parts to a reserve study. There's the components. So it's a list of your common area projects. There's the evaluation of your starting point, which is your percent funded. And you can say, we are 72% funded. And some people may not know really what that means. So you may want to provide the framework. 70% and above is good. 30 to 70% is fair. 0 to 30% is poor. Because if your child comes home with a 71 on their chemistry test, that's a good point. Some parents may be happy, some parents may be sad. David, I think your parents and my parents were both pretty darn sad if we came home with a 71. But 71% funded is a good place reserve-wise. And third is your funding plan and what's recommended compared to what you have been doing. So, what's the gap that you need to change? That's pretty much the main things you need to know. And you can absorb that or you can communicate that in 5 or 10 minutes.
Are there restrictions on what can be reserved for?
Absolutely.
David, go back to components.
Yes. I would say that I will push again to speak on this within the 3-part test that has been explained already. The restrictions are, especially outside of that 3-part test, items that are new installations. So a new installation of a pickleball court that didn't exist before, or new installation of a camera or surveillance system that was never existing previous on that property. New installations are not part of reserves. That is a capital improvement. Right. That's a capital improvement fund. Reserves are for ongoing maintenance, repair, replacement of existing items on your property. Others are typically infrastructure related or non-accessible to the reserve study provider. So within our scope, we are visual inspectors only. We can only provide an opinion on what we see. So a lot of times, foundations, structural load-bearing walls, these are all things that within the scope of a reserve study, we're not able to assess. So you will see that in your reserve study as a non-item or non-funded item. And so,
Unless
you have a point.
Unless,
which is actually, where we had an update to the reserve study standards in 2023. There are recommendations, or can be within reserves, for professional inspections to clarify those items. And so while there are restrictions and limitations in what we can provide, a lot of times we're going to provide guidance to you so that you can go get the information you need to incorporate what's needed into reserves. Some items may never need replacement because they may have what's referred to as an indefinite or indeterminate life. Hopefully, you're never going to have to replace the foundation of your 40-story high-rise. If you did, that would probably result in reconstruction of the building entirely. And so those are the things that we take a look at and we would otherwise exclude or restrict from funding.
Yeah, but if it's deteriorating, we're going to include it in the reserve study. And if your experts can give us some insights, your plumber, your roofer, your HVAC expert, your elevator expert, that kind of stuff, we gather that information. We love getting that information so we can plug it into the budget. What bothers me the most is when there is a state that has a specific list of items and says you must reserve for these things, and then associations in that state fund for only those things. That's when you have a real gap. So think about that 3-part test, speak to your reserve study provider, see it in the reserve component list, fund for what's deteriorating because you want to be prepared.
I'm going to add one example to that, which this isn't a Florida webinar, so I'm not going to harp on it too much. But when they came out with the legislation, we found it crazy, or at least I personally did, that somehow all of these list items were included and elevators were somehow just left off of the major SIRS list as a major, typically major mechanical system within a building that provides potential compliance within that state. But that was one of those major big ticket items that didn't get put into the legislation, so it gets overlooked if you're only funding SIRS.
Yeah, and for Mrs. Johnson on the 13th floor, the elevator is life safety.
Are there any rules or requirements about putting some of your reserve account investing into a shorter term CD to get a better interest rate? For example, say 50% of the reserve balance.
Actually, this is going to be a plug. We're going to have a webinar, I think it's next week actually, with an investment expert. And we're going to talk about some of these kinds of things, but we want you to maximize your interest earning. Every dollar you get from the bank is one less dollar you need to ask for from your homeowners. It's a wonderful thing to get 4% on your reserves instead of 1%. It's wonderful. It's not wonderful to put your reserves at risk of declining in value, because your reserves, David said it a little bit ago, it's for maintaining and replacing your existing projects. When that roof is going to fail, you need your money then. And so you can't be crossing your fingers and hoping that the stock market continues to go up, because everything that goes up comes down. So yes, maximize your reserve interest. Do it in a safe investment. We have a webinar next week with an investment counselor. We'll talk about more of those kinds of things. David?
Nope, I agree with that. Just be safe and don't overexpose yourselves. Yeah. And I don't want to overspeak, because realistically, I find this to be a form of financial investment advice, and we're not those type of advisors. Where we can step in, and your project manager or reserve study provider can step in, is they can say these are the expected costs within the reserve study, and so you should strategically plan, which Robert mentioned on his slide earlier. Funding plan strategy is a part of the reserve study, and they can assist in creating that strategy to the best of their ability, which may involve, if you don't have any immediate projects coming up, it may not be an outlandish action to fund or put 50% of your reserves into a CD. If you don't need them, sure.
Yeah. The danger is when you have a big elevator project next year and you put 75% of your reserves in a 5-year CD. You're like, holy moly, now we have no liquid cash to be able to pay the elevator guy. So you need to do prudent investing in light of your projected expenses. And as David said, a financial advisor that's familiar with reserves and community associations, the first thing they should ask for from you is, okay, show me your reserve study, because that's their plan.
All right. Do you have recommendations for convincing small condo boards that reserve studies are necessary? Many defer maintenance, thinking short term that they will be saving money.
Robert, I can see you boiling again.
Oh, gee. Doesn't matter on size. I was thinking, you're talking about a small board or a small association. And whether it's a small association or a large association, we do see the same things. It's human factors. Every association out there has a tight budget, no doubt. You're all nonprofits. We get that. And it is so human nature to want to not spend the money this year. Maybe we'll just repair it. But that just leads into more repairs, and you end up band-aiding. I've heard the term band-aiding bullet wounds. And you need to spend your money wisely, and at the right time, you need to replace the thing, and then wipe your forehead, and you've got 10 or 20 years where it's going to serve effectively. So talk to your reserve study provider. The statistics industry-wide are that when you replace at the right time, it saves you money in the long run. It's just the right thing to do. So don't be penny wise and pound foolish.
The clear explanation that I have, or clear sentence that I've always held to, is that reserve studies are a form of information. And whether you think you're saving money or not by deferring reserve allocations or reserve funding, wouldn't you like to know what's coming down the way 3, 5, 10, 15 years? We've had associations that have willingly chosen, or at least clients of mine that have willingly chosen not to fund anything. And really for us, the benefit of the product is still there. Knowing that they're not funding anything, they should be very aware of how many special assessments they're going to have, probably after a certain point, year after year after year. And operationally, we don't, or from our standpoint, we don't necessarily agree with that approach, but that's also not our decision to make for the client. Our job is to provide good data and good information so that you as the board of directors and really related the property managers that are assisting the board of directors to make good decisions for the betterment of the community and maintenance of that community in a proactive way.
I just analyzed a study that was front-loaded with a high percent funded for next 5 years and then drops gradually over time, dipping below 50% in 10 years. I assume reserve studies are against this practice.
Sometimes that's literally what happens. When you prepare for a large project, I think about it like boxing. You're there, and sometimes you need to take a big punch. That's an elevator project, a roof project, an asphalt project. It's going to knock you back. But you get up, and then you've got 5 years or 10 years or whatever until the next big punch. So sometimes your reserve fund will be a sawtooth. It doesn't, if you look at the overall plan, probably one of the reasons you got to a strong place so that you could absorb a big punch. So I tend to see something like that more from a multi-year perspective. I'm not bothered if it bounces down for a year.
Paige,
Yep.
would you mind marking this one answered? I wanted to take a look at that question, but I can't find it over here.
Yep, will do. All right. We are a commercial condominium association built in the 1980s without reserves. We now have reserves. We need to say for new large cost projects like drainage work and block walls, can we add these projects to reserves?
That passes the 3-part test.
Those are very specific situations. First thought is yes. And second part is, as Robert said, has to pass that 3-part test.
All right. Our board has suggested having a percentage of our reserve study put aside for weather-related issues as part of our process. Is that acceptable?
So we're talking about maybe windstorm cleanup or snow removal. Paige, you think that's what they're talking about?
Hurricane damage, probably anything along those lines.
There's nothing wrong with having a contingency fund on the side that is available for the board at its discretion. I wouldn't take it out of reserves because every dollar that goes into reserves effectively is earmarked for repairing or replacing something. And if you take it out to put it on the side, then it's not there for the roof. It's not there for the asphalt. It's not there for what it's needed. So we have many associations that have their own discretionary extra fund on the side. Not a bad idea.
I would also state there have been conversations or in the arguments to the 3-part test that if you clarify what frequency that it could be put in, and there is an argument to that, but as Robert stated, it's probably best to go into a discretionary fund that has a bit more flexibility and freedom outside of reserves. Since you're funding it anyways, it would probably be better in that bucket, so to speak, where reserves are intended for direct, most often specific projects. And the scope of a cleanup can be so widely varying from, say, one hurricane to the next or one snowstorm to the next, that it becomes a lot harder to call it reasonably anticipated.
Is the percent funded or account funding and account balance more important?
Percent funded. I used to do a webinar with another RS, big guy, well over 6 feet and maybe 100 pounds bigger than me. And you don't know, I'm not a big guy. So we would stand up in front and we'd do this presentation and we would joke about how the other gentleman's jacket wouldn't fit me, my jacket wouldn't fit him. So it doesn't matter that I have a very nice blue blazer or he has a very nice blue blazer. It's got to fit. And so it's not, do I have a good nice blue blazer or not? The question is, does what I have fit me? So percent funded is more important than cash in the bank.
And I'll give one more example before we move on from this. To a lot of people, $1 million sounds like a large sum of money, and it is, except if you are staring down the barrel of a $1.5 million elevator modernization project, followed by a $3 million roof replacement and building painting project, et cetera, so on, then that dollar amount doesn't matter, because it sounds like a lot of money, but in the context of what needs to be done, it's not at all. It's actually a very minute amount of money, and you need 5 times that to fund the projects coming due. Percent funded will show that, where, the ongoing deterioration may be valued at, say, $10 million. $1 million is not a lot in the form of percent funded, because that's 10% funded. And we know that's a very high risk of special assessment moving forward. So we're looking at it as a dollar value is only looking at it at the surface without any further context.
All right. Per reserve study standards, there are components that should be included in a reserve study that do not qualify as a capital expense per IRS regulations. Is there a recommendation on how the HOA should handle these rule differences?
Yes. Fund your reserves per National Reserve Study standards and pay your taxes per IRS standards.
I'll leave it at that. I got enough on that.
All right. How is a reserve study a plan if the issue is years of underfunding and delaying maintenance?
Well, it's because prior boards didn't plan, and now you're trying to be serious about things. If you're not taking care of your health, there will come a year in your life where you realize, I have a current health problem. I can no longer avoid the issue. Well, if you would have taken years to care more for your health, you would not be in this crisis. Same with the building. Maybe prior boards didn't care. They didn't fund reserves. They didn't do reserves. They just floated downstream. Now you're in a jam. So now you need to plan. And arguably, the truth is, you will be in catch-up mode for a while. 5 or 10 years, maybe, David?
Could be the entire 30-year plan. We've had funding plans that we provided clients, that the very same ones that say, we're just going to special assess every year. And then you get a new wave of owners that are tired of that approach and don't want to pay for the past discretions forever. And they set a proactive plan that, say, over the 30-year period will be a consistent, steady increase of percent funded to eventually get there. It's tough to pay for those past transgressions, and ultimately the frustration is only with past, or should only be with past membership. It shouldn't be with the existing board that's trying to do the right thing, or the property manager that's also trying to maybe advocate for funding the reserves properly, because it makes everybody's lives easier, and should over time maintain or promote high property values, improve property values at that community as you're conducting proactive maintenance. It'll also save money when you're not doing a bunch of emergency fixes because you don't have any money and you didn't do that proactive repair that could have prolonged the life another couple of years. And so I think that's where that one.
All right. If our irrigation system has a major break and it is an asset in our reserve study, if the cost exceeds 1% of our budget, can I use the reserve money to fix it?
On the surface, it sounds like, it seems like yes. Yeah. If it's a reserve component, yes.
Yeah. Either way, I'd reach out to your reserve study professional. They probably know, they've probably been there, they've probably seen the asset, they're looking at the reserve study, they know your situation. Lean on them. But both David and I lean towards yes.
Great. We have time for one final question here. As a reminder, any unanswered questions will be answered in the webinar outline. All right, final question here. We have received bids for some reserve items that are significantly lower than the replacement cost listed in the reserve study. What should we do if this trend continues and we consistently find we can replace items for less than what we have budgeted? Aren't we at risk for overfunding our reserves in the long run? Each year, the reserves are recommended to be increased by 3% to keep up with inflation.
Yeah, I'll take that one on. Ultimately, this can and will likely occur for many associations throughout the country. Our cost estimates are regionally and locationally driven, so we do our best to track that information. But in any given case where you receive bids, you're probably going to receive a pretty wide spread. The one caution that I would look to is the quality of the vendor, the quality of the material or system that is being replaced, and the scope of the project. And one of the key examples I can give is, say, an elevator modernization. Hydraulic elevators for that modernization piece can often include or exclude what's known as the pump unit. It's the mechanicals or mechanical pieces of the elevator system. If that pump unit is excluded and you receive a bid, it's still going to say modernization, but it could be $30,000, $40,000 less than what we would fund in the reserves for a full modernization, which includes both the controls and the pump unit. So there is some variance in scope of what can be expected or is funded in a reserve study and what you may receive a bid on. And so that is the first caution that I would advise, is to make sure you're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. Secondly, you could, if that was the case for every component throughout time, but when you conduct your next reserve study update, that reserve study provider should ask for that history, and those components should be updated accordingly to the price you are paying, or they should provide a description or explanation as to why they believe that cost is not where it should be. Or maybe they believe you're just getting a great break. All of those things are possible.
Yeah. I like what David said. Our theme here at Association Reserves, and David will know it when I say it, make sure every reserve study is better than the one before. And so you're always tuning and retuning. What have we learned about the client? What have we learned from their cost history? What prices can we adjust? How can we adjust the life expectancies? All these kinds of things. So it's a matter of tuning and retuning. If you're finding the prices are lower, then yeah, maybe we overestimated what things are costing in your local geographic area. But I want to caution you, just like David said, I had a oceanfront client, and I was trying to remember. So I can't remember if it was like Miami or Ocean City, Maryland, or Santa Monica, but I remember oceanfront, and they were getting bids on their cooling tower that was on the roof of their high rise. And one bid was like $250,000. One bid was like $175,000. That's a lot of money. And I called the two providers and said, what's the difference? And I found out that the higher cost one was made of stainless steel. The lower cost one was not. Higher cost one was going to last 20 years. Lower cost one was going to last maybe 10 years. So you got to see what you're really buying. The asset really needs to be well suited for its location. And sometimes that makes a big difference in the cost.
Maybe that's an idea for a webinar moving forward, is kind of digging into some of the variances that we see. I mean, as you've gone through, I've bought asphalt, the difference in depth for mill and overlay, for pool resurfacing, whether they use Diamond Bright versus Pebble Tech versus some other gunite material.
Yep.
Those all have different price points. Really the SEER and efficiency levels of AC systems, and whether they're coastal equipped or not, they all have significantly varying prices as well. So it's a very interesting topic, and hopefully the case is not that it's abundantly overestimated on all of their components. But if that is the case, it is something to provide to the reserve study provider. I'm sure they'd be happy to update all those components and learn something along the way that maybe we're overshooting in that specific area.
And for all clients and prospects, basically our audience listening here, I want you to understand that when we look at what the prices are nowadays and we finish your reserve study, we wince when we see what we need to recommend that you set aside towards reserves. And if you can help us lower that number by saying, hey, I think you're overestimating our costs here in our metropolitan area, that's going to help us, because we feel it's not our money, but we know we're giving it to the board, and the board is going to have pain recommending a higher reserve funding amount than is necessary. So yeah, help us do our job well, provide that information to us, communicate it. And we don't want you to be underfunded. We want you to be well prepared.
All right. Thank you both. Robert, I believe you have some closing remarks.
Sure. I will get back to those. Okay. So in conclusion, the expenses are there. They're driven by Mother Nature and Father Time. You only have a choice of how to pay. It's not how much, but how. It's going to be budgeted funding or special assessments or loans. And there's more to it. We want you to be effective in your role. Understand that real estate is expensive. You may need to pound that point hard many times throughout the year. Inflation is real, all these kinds of things. And use appropriate words. We're not setting aside for the future because that sounds like someone else's problem. What you're doing is paying the ongoing cost of deterioration. Basically, every month you're paying a little bit, a little bit, a little bit for what it costs to keep the place going, the lights on. Because you are indeed paying for the funding needs, you're not contributing. It's a bill just like any other bill. So set aside budget for that ongoing cost of deterioration, collect the funds, do your projects in a timely manner, and then regularly talk to your reserve study provider to make sure that you're on track. If you have a question, if you need it tuned, if you need it updated, all those kinds of things. I want to encourage you that reserves are a very significant part of your budget. What we see is reserve funding tends to be 15 to 40% of the typical association's budget. A real common number is somewhere around 25%, and that's what I'm showing here in the pie chart. And the nuance of that is just barely keeping your reserve fund cash positive or baseline funding, as David said earlier. That's about 22% fund of average association's budget. So a little more margin to have your reserve fund be strong and insulate your homeowners from a special assessment. That's money well spent. That's where you get a lot of benefit. So budget to pay your bills, the bill of ongoing deterioration, you minimize special assessments, minimize deferred maintenance, you minimize those extra costs that your association from things piling up, and you maximize owner enjoyment. It's a nice place to come home to. It looks sharp. It's easy to be a board member there because there's money to get things done. And it's nice because maximize property values. A 2-bedroom just sold for a record number. The home's there, the 5-bedroom unit just sold for a record number. That's great to be able to say at an annual meeting. So don't focus on particular projects, a roof or asphalt, because some people care about this, they care about that, something they don't care about anything in the future, like the gentleman in this cartoon. Focus on the ongoing cost of deterioration because that's what you're trying to accomplish here. It's a budgeting process. It's not musical chairs. And we spoke about in a couple of the questions, it may take a few years to get there. We want you to start on that road, and we are here to guide. You guys get to be the hero. You guys get to be the ones who reap the rewards from the higher property values. All we do is stand along on the side and say, this is the way forward. This is the way to stay in the middle of the trail. So we're at the end of our time here. We are Association Reserves. You can find us at reservestudy.com. Paige said it earlier, so this may be the first time you've seen it in writing. We 2 weeks ago crossed 100,000 reserve studies. That's a fun number. We've learned a lot from that, and we want to communicate those lessons learned to you. More information on our website. There's more information on YouTube. Plenty of lessons like this, webinars like this. And we have a book if you're a reader. It's called Understanding Reserves. You can get it on Amazon for $29.99. And we have this UPlanet online funding calculator. It's a great little tool. We didn't use it in our examples today because what we were talking about had to do with more concepts rather than this is how it works. But it's there. It's a cool little tool. You get your completed reserve study on this online tool in addition to a PDF. So you get to play with some of the numbers. It's a great tool and fun thing to have. And another resource for our board members, we have a weekly 30-minute podcast to encourage and equip you for the hard work you do for your associations. We have subject matter experts. We feature some board heroes. We talk about current events, a lot of things that make you a little better equipped to handle the challenges of being a board member at a community association. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. It's called HOA Insights, Common Sense for Common Areas, or you can watch it on YouTube or listen to it on the website, which is hoainsights.org. And with that, I'll turn the program back to Paige, who will have a few concluding remarks. Paige.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, David. That concludes our webinar. If anyone is interested in a recorded version of this or any other webinar, you can search for them on YouTube or on the Association Reserve's webinar page. If you enjoyed today's session and would like to receive the Association Reserve's newsletter or announcements of future webinars, please visit www.reservestudy.com and scroll down to the bottom of the page to sign up for the newsletter. As you exit this webinar, a survey will display. If you could help us out by completing that survey, we will be happy to email you an outline of the webinar. That outline will include answers to all the questions that our limited time didn't allow for us to address and those that we did address. I want to thank you all for attending. If you have any questions or if there's any way we can be of service to you, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Thank you, Paige. Thank you, David.
Thank you, everybody.